Behind the closed doors of a weathered Colorado cabin, a young woman's screams were swallowed by the howling wind. Her own mother was the monster. She thought she would die in that dirt floor room until a towering stranger descended from the peaks, changing her tragic destiny forever. The year was 1881, and the mining town of Pine Ridge, Colorado, was a place where people only minded their own business. It was a rugged settlement built on silver dust, cheap whiskey, and secrets. According to the county ledger kept by Mayor Thaddeus Montgomery, there were over 600 souls in Pine Ridge, but not one of them had the courage to intervene in the nightmare unfolding at the end of Elm Street. In a dilapidated shack leaning heavily against a grove of dead pine trees lived Henrietta Corcoran, known to the town simply as Hetty, and her 19-year-old daughter, Cora. To the outside world, Hetty was a hardened widow who took in laundry to survive. Her husband, Josiah, had walked out on them 10 years prior, chasing a rumor of gold in California, never to be heard from again. The abandonment had curdled something deep inside Hetty. She became a woman made of rusted iron and bitter poison, and every ounce of her venom was poured directly onto her only child. Cora was a girl who lived like a frightened sparrow. She possessed a quiet, understated beauty, with dark hair that framed a face perpetually painted with the faded yellow and purple hues of fading bruises. The abuse was not a secret. It was a daily, rhythmic reality. The townspeople heard the sharp cracks of the willow switch, the thud of objects thrown against the thin wooden walls, and Hetty's gravelly voice hurling unspeakable insults. Yet, Deputy Miller and the local mercantile owner, Mr. Abernathy, simply turned their heads. In the brutal landscape of the wild frontier, a mother's discipline, no matter how excessive, was considered family business. Every morning, Cora's day began before the sun crested the jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains. She was expected to draw freezing water from the well, chop the firewood, and scrub the bleeding knuckles off her hands while washing the town's dirty garments. If the fire smoked too much, Hetty struck her. If the bread was too dense, Hetty used the wooden spoon on her shoulders. Cora had learned to make herself small, to swallow her tears, and to exist in the spaces between her mother's violent outbursts. But survival was becoming a tenuous prospect. Hetty's mind was slipping further into a dark abyss, fueled by the cheap gin she bought from the local saloon. The beatings were growing more severe, shifting from cruel punishments to unhinged, deadly rages. Cora often lay awake on her thin corn husk mattress, staring at the frost on the window pane, whispering silent prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening. She dreamed of the mountains that loomed over the town, vast, silent, and free. It was mid-November when the mountain man came to town. His name was Levi Sterling. He was a trapper who lived high up on the timberline, a place where the snow stayed year-round and the air was thin enough to make a flatlander faint. Levi only descended into Pine Ridge twice a year to trade his thick pelts for coffee, gunpowder, and salt. He was a giant of a man, standing well over 6 feet, clad in heavy buckskin and a wolf pelt coat. His face was weathered by brutal winters, and a jagged scar ran down the side of his jaw, a souvenir from a grizzly bear that hadn't survived their encounter. Levi was a man of terrifying silence. When he walked down the muddy thoroughfare, the loud, boisterous miners stepped out of his way. He didn't drink in the saloon, he didn't visit the brothels, and he didn't speak unless it was absolutely necessary. On a frigid Tuesday afternoon, Levi was standing on the boardwalk outside Abernathy's Provisions, securing 50 pounds of flour to the back of his massive packhorse. Across the street, the laundry line outside the Corcoran shack snapped under the weight of wet, freezing canvas pants. Inside the store, men were haggling, but outside, the street suddenly went dead quiet. The door to the shack burst open. Hetty Corcoran stormed out into the freezing mud, her face flushed red with rage, clutching a heavy leather harnessing strap in her fist. Cora stumbled backward out of the door, her hands raised defensively over her face. Her thin, calico dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing skin marred by fresh, angry welts. "You clumsy, worthless wretch!" Hetty shrieked, the sound echoing off the storefronts. "Do you know what that canvas costs? You'll wash it again in the ice water, and I'll take the hide off your back for the trouble." Cora tripped over a frozen rut in the road and fell hard into the mud. She scrambled backward, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it made her breath hitch. She didn't cry out for help. She knew no one would come. Across the street, Levi Sterling stopped tying the rope on his pack horse. His gloved hands went still. He turned his head slowly, his piercing gray eyes locking onto the scene unfolding in the mud. The town of Pine Ridge watched from their windows and porches, waiting for the gruesome spectacle to pass. But the mountain man did not look away. The leather strap came down with a sickening crack, striking the frozen earth just inches from Cora's face as she rolled out of the way. Hetty lunged forward, her fingers twisting into the dark, tangled hair of her daughter. She yanked Cora's head back, raising the heavy strap high into the frigid air for a devastating blow. Cora squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact that would surely split her skin. But the blow never landed. A shadow, vast and blocking out the pale winter sun, fell over them. Hetty let out a startled gasp as a massive, leather-clad hand reached out and caught the descending strap mid-air. The grip was immovable, like a vice clamped around the leather. Hetty jerked her head up to see Levi Sterling towering over her. His expression was not angry. It was entirely devoid of emotion, an unsettling stillness that was far more terrifying than any rage. "Let go of it," Levi said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, quiet but vibrating with an undeniable threat. "This is none of your concern, mountain trash," Hetty spat, trying to wrench the strap from his grip. "She's my daughter. She ruined Mr. Higgins's laundry. Let go." Levi didn't blink. With a casual flick of his wrist, he yanked the strap from Hetty's hands with such force that it spun the older woman around, dropping her into the mud. Levi tossed the strap away. Cora remained on the ground, trembling uncontrollably, her eyes darting between her mother and the giant stranger. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to hide the bruises on her arms. Levi glanced down at her, taking in the bruised cheekbone, the split lip, the sheer starvation evident in her hollow features. Something dark flickered in his gray eyes, a storm brewing behind the calm exterior. Hetty scrambled to her feet, her pride wounded, her fury redirecting toward the trapper. "I'll have the deputy on you. You can't put your hands on me. She's my blood, my property until she weds, and no man wants a broken, useless thing like her." "Property," Levi repeated, the word rolling slowly off his tongue. He stepped over the mud puddle, closing the distance between himself and Hetty. The townsfolk on the boardwalk held their breath. Mayor Montgomery, watching from the bank window, considered sending for the deputy, but no one wanted to cross Levi Sterling. "If she's property," Levi said softly, "then she has a price." Hetty froze, her rant dying in her throat. She looked at the towering man, blinking in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Levi reached beneath his heavy wolf pelt coat. He unclipped a thick, heavy leather pouch from his belt. The sound it made when he pulled it free was unmistakable, the heavy, clinking sound of pure coin. He tossed it through the air. It landed squarely in the mud at Hetty's feet with a heavy thud. "There's $400 in minted silver in that bag," Levi said, his voice carrying clearly in the dead silence of the street. "Enough to buy a house in Denver and drink yourself to death in comfort. You take it, and the girl comes with me." Cora's heart stopped. She stared at the leather pouch in the mud. $400. It was an astronomical sum, more money than the town's bank held in its vault on any given day. She looked up at Levi, absolute terror seizing her chest. Was he buying her? Was she trading the familiar hell of her mother's fists for an unspeakable nightmare in a mountain cabin with a wild man? Hetty stared at the bag. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from sheer, unadulterated greed. She looked at the bag, then at her daughter shivering in the mud, then back at the bag. There was not a second of maternal hesitation. The twist of the knife in Cora's heart was how easily, how eagerly, her mother dropped to her knees in the mud to snatch the silver. Hetty weighed the pouch in her hands, a sickening smile spreading across her face. "Take her," she whispered, not even looking at Cora. "She's your problem now. If she dies on that mountain, don't bring her body back here." Levi turned his back on Hetty in disgust. He walked over to Cora, who was paralyzed by fear. She pressed her back against the wooden post of the porch, tears finally spilling hot down her freezing cheeks. Levi stopped a few feet away. He didn't reach for her. He didn't try to drag her. He slowly unbuttoned his heavy fleece-lined outer coat, took it off, and held it out. "You're freezing," was all he said. Cora hesitated, looking into his eyes. There was no malice in them, only a quiet patience. With trembling hands, she reached out and pulled the massive coat around her frail shoulders. It was warm, smelling of pine needles, wood smoke, and horse leather. It swallowed her whole. "Can you ride?" he asked. Cora gave a jerky, terrified nod. Levi turned and walked toward his horse, trusting her to follow. And she did, because behind her, Hetty was already walking toward the saloon with the silver, and ahead of her was the only path out of Pine Ridge. Levi effortlessly lifted her into the saddle of his large black gelding before climbing up behind her. He didn't hold her inappropriately. He simply took the reins, keeping his arms on either side of her as a barrier against the wind. As they rode out of town, heading toward the treacherous snow-covered trails of the San Juan Mountains, Cora watched the town of Pine Ridge disappear behind them. She was entirely at the mercy of a man who had just bought her life. As the first flakes of a brutal winter storm began to fall, Cora realized she had no idea what kind of life awaited her in the high peaks. She only knew she could never go back. The journey up into the jagged teeth of the San Juan Mountains was a blur of biting wind and blinding white. As the black gelding trudged higher, the timberline swallowed them, leaving the miserable, gossiping town of Pine Ridge far below. Cora clung to the saddle horn, her knuckles white beneath the sleeves of Levi Sterling's massive wolf pelt coat. She was trembling, though whether from the plunging temperature or the sheer terror of her situation, she could not tell. For 3 hours, they climbed in absolute silence. The only sounds were the crunch of the horses' hooves breaking through the crust of the snow and the howling of the wind through the ancient blue spruce trees. Levi rode behind her, a solid, immovable wall against the freezing gusts. He did not speak. He did not tighten his grip inappropriately. He simply guided the horse with expert precision through treacherous switchbacks and narrow ledges where a single misstep meant a 1,000-foot drop into the canyon below. Cora's mind raced with horrifying possibilities. Hetty's venomous words echoed in her ears. No man wants a broken, useless thing like her. Why, then, had this towering, scarred trapper emptied his life savings into the mud for her? The men in the mining camps bought women for one reason, and the transaction was always brutal. Cora squeezed her eyes shut, trying to mentally prepare herself for whatever dark, isolated fate awaited her at the top of the world. Dusk was falling, painting the snow in deep shades of violet and bruised blue when they finally crested a ridge. Tucked into a sheltered alcove of granite, protected from the worst of the northern winds, sat a cabin. It was not the crude, drafty shack Cora had expected. It was a fortress of thick, hand-hewn logs, meticulously chinked with mortar, boasting a heavy slate roof and a sturdy stone chimney that puffed a welcoming plume of white smoke into the twilight. A large woodshed attached to the side was stacked to the ceiling with split pine. It was a home built by a man who intended to survive the harshest conditions God could throw at him. Levi dismounted smoothly, his boots crunching in the snow. He reached up and, grasping Cora by the waist, lifted her down as easily as if she weighed no more than a bundle of dry kindling. Her legs buckled the moment her boots hit the ground, numb from the cold and the ride. Levi caught her by the elbow, steadying her without a word, and led her toward the heavy oak door. Inside, the cabin was a revelation. It was a single, large room, impeccably clean. The floors were swept wood, not dirt. Heavy pelts of bear and elk served as rugs. A massive stone hearth dominated the far wall, radiating a deep, residual heat from the banked coals. There was a sturdy oak table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and in the corner, a large bed frame piled high with thick woolen blankets and furs. "Sit," Levi commanded quietly, his voice a low rumble. It was the first word he had spoken since leaving town. Cora scrambled to one of the chairs, pulling the oversized coat tighter around herself. She watched with wide, fearful eyes as Levi went about his routine. He lit a kerosene lantern, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow, then stoked the fire and swung a heavy iron kettle over the flames. He moved with a deliberate, quiet grace that belied his massive size. When the stew was hot, he filled a tin bowl, set it on the table in front of her, and placed a chunk of dense sourdough bread beside it. "Eat," he said. Cora looked at the steaming venison stew, Her stomach cramped with violent hunger. She hadn't eaten since the previous morning, but her fear kept her paralyzed. In her mother's house, food was a weapon. It was withheld for punishment and snatched away for perceived insolence. Levi sat across the table, watching her. He didn't touch his own food. He saw the way she flinched when he moved his hand to pick up his coffee cup. He saw the bruised, hollowed-out shell of a girl who was waiting for the trap to spring. "I didn't buy you to starve you," Levi said, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "Eat." With a trembling hand, Cora picked up the spoon. The first bite was a shock of rich, savory warmth that brought unbidden tears to her eyes. She ate quickly, anticipating that the bowl would be yanked away, but Levi merely poured himself another cup of black coffee and waited until she had scraped the tin clean. When night fully descended, the silence of the mountain pressed in against the cabin walls. Cora sat rigidly in her chair, dreading what was to come. There was only one bed. This was the moment she had been dreading since the silver hit the mud. Levi stood up, towering over the table. He walked toward the corner of the room, opened a heavy cedar chest, and pulled out a thick buffalo robe. To Cora's absolute shock, he didn't walk toward the bed. He walked to the hearth, laid the heavy robe out on the hard wooden floorboards in front of the fire, and unbuckled his gun belt. "The bed is yours," Levi said, turning his back to her to tend the fire. Cora stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "But it's your bed, and you need it more than I do," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Go to sleep, Cora. Nobody is going to hurt you here." She crept into the bed fully clothed, burying herself under the heavy furs. She lay awake for hours, watching the flickering firelight dance across the broad back of the mountain man, sleeping on the floor. It defied every rule of the brutal world she knew. The true test of her new reality came 3 days later. Cora had insisted on taking over the domestic chores. It was the only way she knew how to justify her existence, the only currency she had ever possessed. Levi was outside chopping wood. Cora was washing the tin plates in a basin of hot, soapy water. Her hands, still slick with lye soap, fumbled. A heavy ceramic mug, one of the few delicate things in the cabin, slipped from her grasp and shattered into a dozen pieces against the stone hearth. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Cora froze. The blood drained from her face. A cold, familiar terror seized her chest, squeezing her lungs until she couldn't breathe. In Hetty's house, a broken dish meant the willow switch, or worse, the back of a cast-iron skillet. The cabin door opened. Levi stepped inside, snow dusting his shoulders, an axe in one hand. He stopped, taking in the shattered mug and Cora, who was violently shaking, her arms raised defensively over her head, her eyes screwed shut. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, bracing for the impact, her voice cracking in pure panic. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Please don't. Please." She heard the heavy thud of the axe being set down. She heard his heavy boots cross the wooden floor. She squeezed her eyes tighter. But the blow never came. Instead, she heard the soft clinking of pottery. She opened one eye. Levi was on his knees, his massive, calloused hands carefully gathering the broken shards of the mug. "Careful where you step," Levi said softly, not looking up. "You're barefoot. The edges are sharp." Cora lowered her arms, her chest heaving as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. You're not going to strike me?" Levi stopped gathering the pieces. He looked up at her, and for the first time, Cora saw a flash of genuine emotion in his weathered face. It wasn't anger, it was a profound, aching sorrow. "Cora," Levi said, his voice as steady and solid as the mountain beneath them. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are never going to be struck in this house. Not for a broken cup. Not for a burnt meal. Not for anything. The cruelty stays down in the valley. Up here, there is only peace." He stood up, dumped the shards into the iron waste bin, and walked back out the door to chop wood, leaving Cora standing alone in the kitchen, weeping not from fear, but from the overwhelming, terrifying relief of salvation. By January, the San Juan Mountains were buried under 8 feet of snow. The world outside the cabin was a blinding, impassable sea of white, locking them in. But inside, a quiet transformation was taking place. The bruises on Cora's face had faded into memories, replaced by a healthy flush in her cheeks. The hollowed-out starvation of her frame had filled out, thanks to Levi's endless supply of dried elk meat and winter squash. But the physical healing was nothing compared to the shifting landscape of her spirit. Levi was not a master. He was an instructor. He realized early on that treating Cora like fragile glass only perpetuated her fear. Instead, he treated her like a partner. He taught her how to properly skin a rabbit, how to cure meat with salt and hickory smoke, and, most importantly, how to shoot the heavy Winchester rifle he kept by the door. "A mountain doesn't care if you're a man or a woman," he told her one afternoon as she sighted down the barrel at a dead stump. "It only cares if you know how to survive." They spoke little, but the silence between them had evolved. It was no longer the tense, suffocating silence of fear, but a comfortable, shared quiet. Cora learned the subtle shifts in Levi's mood, the way his jaw clenched when a storm was brewing, the rare, barely perceptible softening of his eyes when she hummed a tune while baking bread. Yet, Levi remained an enigma. He was deeply protective, yet emotionally impenetrable. He still slept on the buffalo robe by the fire, never crossing the invisible boundary he had drawn on that very first night. But the mountain has a way of stripping away secrets, usually through blood and ice. The blizzard hit on a Tuesday. The locals down in the valley called it the White Death. The wind howled with the ferocity of a screaming demon, ripping shingles from roofs and burying the world in a blinding, freezing chaos. Levi had gone out just before the storm broke to check a trap line on the northern ridge. He was supposed to be back by noon. By 3 o'clock, the sky was pitch black, and the snow was piling against the windows in heavy, terrifying drifts. Cora paced the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of a man. She was afraid for one. She kept the lantern burning in the window, a desperate beacon in the endless dark. It was nearly midnight when the heavy oak door violently burst open. A rush of freezing air and snow exploded into the room, followed by the massive form of Levi Sterling. He collapsed onto the wooden floorboards, the door slamming shut behind him on the wind. "Levi!" Cora screamed, rushing to his side. He was covered in snow, but beneath the white crust, the entire right side of his heavy buckskin coat was saturated with a dark, freezing crimson. He was gasping for air, his face deathly pale. "Cougar!" Levi wheezed, his gray eyes glazed with pain and shock. "Cornered in the rocks. Had to use my knife." Cora's hands shook as she tore at his heavy coat, exposing his shoulder and ribs. The big cat had gotten him before it died. 3 deep, jagged lacerations ripped across his torso, dangerously close to his lung. The blood was flowing freely. Panic threatened to drown her. She was a laundress, a beaten girl from the valley, not a surgeon. But as she looked at Levi's fading eyes, she realized that if she broke now, the only man who had ever shown her kindness would die on this floor. "Hold on," Cora said, her voice dropping into a register of iron resolve she didn't know she possessed. She flew across the room, grabbing towels, the bottle of whiskey Levi used for medicinal purposes, and her sewing kit. She dragged him closer to the raging fire. "This is going to hurt," she warned, uncorking the whiskey. "Pour it," he gritted out. She poured the raw alcohol directly into the open wounds. Levi roared, a guttural sound of agony that shook the cabin rafters, his massive hands gripping the floorboards until his knuckles cracked. Cora didn't flinch. She threaded a heavy bone needle with thick cotton thread, her hands suddenly steady. For an hour, while the blizzard raged outside, Cora worked. She stitched the torn flesh of the giant mountain man, her hands stained red. When she finally tied the last knot and bound his chest tightly with clean linen, she collapsed back on her heels, exhausted. By morning, the bleeding had stopped, but a violent fever had set in. Infection was the true killer of the frontier. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm battered the cabin, and Levi fought a war inside his own mind. He thrashed under the heavy furs Cora had piled over him, soaked in sweat. Cora rarely left his side, constantly bathing his face with cool water, forcing drops of broth past his cracked lips. It was on the second night of the fever that the impenetrable wall around Levi Sterling finally cracked. In the grip of delirium, his tough exterior vanished. He began to mutter, tossing his head side to side. "No, please, Pa, stop. Don't hit her. I've got the money. I've got the silver." Cora froze, the damp cloth suspended over his forehead. Levi reached out blindly, his massive hand gripping Cora's wrist with bruising force, though his eyes were squeezed shut. "Sophia," he wept. The towering, unbreakable mountain man was crying, tears tracking through the dirt and sweat on his face. "I'm sorry, Sophia. I came back. I got the silver. But I was too late. I'm so sorry he killed you." Cora's breath hitched in her throat. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly slammed together with devastating clarity. If she's property, then she has a price. He hadn't bought Cora because he wanted a wife. He hadn't bought her to serve him. He bought her because when he looked across the muddy street in Pine Ridge and saw a mother standing over a terrified girl with a leather strap, he saw the sister he failed to save. He had traded his life savings to buy a ghost, a second chance at life. Tears spilled down Cora's cheeks, dripping onto Levi's burning skin. She didn't pull her wrist away. Instead, she laid her other hand gently over his trembling knuckles. "I'm here, Levi," she whispered into the dark, stormy cabin. "I'm safe. You saved me. You weren't too late." Slowly, as the night wore on, the grip on her wrist loosened, and his breathing leveled out. When the fever finally broke on the fourth morning, the storm outside had passed. Sunlight streamed violently through the frosted window panes, illuminating the cabin. Levi opened his eyes. They were clear, exhausted, but lucid. He looked up to find Cora asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting near his shoulder, her hand still loosely clasping his. He didn't wake her. He just watched her, the steady rise and fall of her chest, the peaceful curve of her mouth. The heavy, suffocating guilt that had driven him into the isolated peaks for a decade felt, for the very first time, a little lighter. He had gone to town for flour and salt, but he had brought back salvation not just for the battered girl in the mud, but for himself. The quiet mountain man gently turned his hand over, intertwining his thick fingers with hers, holding fast as the morning sun chased the last of the shadows from the room. Spring arrived in the San Juan Mountains, not with a gentle whisper, but with the violent, rushing roar of melting ice. The world transformed from a silent white tomb into an explosion of emerald pines, blooming columbines, and rushing creeks. Inside the cabin, a similar thaw had taken place. Levi had fully recovered from the cougar attack, but the dynamic between him and Cora was forever altered. The night his fever broke, the invisible wall separating them crumbled. He no longer slept on the buffalo robe by the fire. At first, they simply shared the bed for warmth, two wounded souls seeking comfort in the dark. But as the snows receded, the hesitant brushes of their hands turned into lingering touches, and the quiet respect they harbored for one another blossomed into a fierce, unspoken love. Levi had finally told her the whole truth. When he was a young man, he had left his younger sister, Sophia, in the care of their violent, drunken father, to go pan for gold, promising to return with enough money to buy them a new life. He struck a vein, but when he returned to their homestead, he was a week too late. His father had beaten Sophia to death in a drunken rage. The trauma drove Levi into the mountains, vowing to never care for another human being again, until he saw Hetty Corcoran raising that leather strap in the mud. "I bought a ghost," Levi whispered one evening, his rough hand gently tracing the curve of Cora's jaw. "But a woman saved my life. You aren't her, Cora. You're my heart." Cora had wept, pressing her face into his scarred palm, finally realizing she was truly, deeply loved for exactly who she was. But the valley below had not forgotten them. It was mid-May when the past rode up the mountain. Cora was in the garden she had just planted, her hands deep in the rich, dark soil, when the black gelding in the corral let out a sharp, warning whinny. Cora stood up, shielding her eyes against the bright afternoon sun. 3 riders were coming up the treacherous switchback trail. Her blood ran cold. Leading the pack was Jeb Rollins, a notorious enforcer and bounty hunter from Pine Ridge, who made his living doing the dirty work for the Silver Barons. Behind him rode a hired gun named Rufus, but it was the third rider that made Cora's breath catch in her throat. It was Hetty. Her mother looked ragged, her face sunken and her clothes stained. Hetty had spent Levi's $400 in a matter of weeks, squandering it on gin, faro tables, and bad debts. Desperate and facing the wrath of the town's unsavory creditors, Hetty had spun a lie. She told Jeb Rollins that the mountain man hadn't just paid her a handful of silver. She claimed Levi was hoarding a massive stolen fortune up in his cabin, and that he was holding her daughter hostage. It was the perfect excuse for a legal robbery. Levi stepped out of the woodshed, an axe resting on his shoulder. He took one look at the riders, dropped the axe, and calmly walked to stand beside Cora. "Stay behind me," Levi murmured, his gray eyes turning flat and dangerous. The riders pulled up to the edge of the clearing. Jeb Rollins tipped his greasy hat back, a predatory grin splitting his face. "Afternoon, Sterling. Come to collect the girl. Her poor mother here says she was taken against her will." "She was bought and paid for," Levi said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "Turn around, Rollins." "Now, we both know a transaction like that ain't legal," Jeb sneered, resting his hand on the pearl handle of his Colt revolver. "And word is, you've got a whole chest of stolen mining silver in that cabin. We're taking the girl, and we're taking the money as a fine." Hetty pointed a shaking, bony finger at Levi. "He stole her! Give her back, you animal!" She then looked at Cora, her voice dripping with the old, familiar venom. "Get over here, you worthless wretch! You're coming back to wash the linens." 6 months ago, Cora would have dropped to her knees. She would have cried, begged, and ultimately surrendered to the terror of her mother's voice. But the girl in the mud was dead. Cora didn't hide behind Levi. She stepped out from his shadow. She walked calmly to the heavy oak door of the cabin, reached inside, and pulled out the Winchester rifle. She racked the lever with a sharp, metallic clack that echoed like a thunderclap across the mountain clearing. She brought the stock to her shoulder, aiming the barrel directly at Jeb Rollins' chest. Hetty gasped, her eyes going wide. "Cora, put that down!" "You sold me for silver," Cora said, her voice ringing out clear and steady, devoid of any fear. "I am not your property. I am not your daughter. And there is no silver in that cabin. If you draw that pistol, Mr. Rollins, I will blow you out of your saddle before your gun clears the leather." Jeb hesitated. He looked at the girl, then at the massive, scarred trapper beside her, whose hand was now hovering over his own heavy revolver. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a suicide run. Rufus, the hired gun, nervously backed his horse up a few paces. "Jeb, I ain't dying for a crazy old drunk's gambling debts. I'm out." Rufus turned his horse and spurted down the trail. Jeb cursed under his breath. He glared at Cora, seeing the absolute iron resolve in her dark eyes. The mountain had forged her into something unbreakable. Slowly, Jeb raised his hands, surrendering to the standoff. He grabbed the reins of Hetty's horse. "Let me go," Hetty shrieked, struggling. "The silver! She's mine!" "Shut up, you crazy old bat," Jeb growled, turning both their horses around. "You're lucky she didn't shoot you herself." Cora kept the rifle raised until the riders disappeared completely down the switchback, swallowed by the dense pines. When the silence of the mountain finally returned, she lowered the weapon. Her hands weren't shaking. Levi stepped up behind her. He wrapped his massive, warm arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of pine and sweet earth. "You didn't need me to protect you at all," Levi murmured, pride swelling in his chest. Cora leaned back into his embrace, a soft, radiant smile touching her lips. "I don't need you to protect me, Levi. I just need you to stay with me." High above the cruelty of the valley, under the vast, endless sky of the Colorado frontier, the mountain man and the girl who learned to fight finally walked back into their home, ready to face whatever the wild world had to offer together. Did Cora's incredible transformation from a terrified victim to a fierce mountain woman leave you breathless? If you loved this Wild West tale of redemption, survival, and unexpected romance, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more thrilling historical dramas. Tell us in the comments, would you have stood up to Hetty? See you in the next story.